A recent revelation from scientists at the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory has some wondering what's going on underground in Yellowstone Park. They've been monitoring an uplift that has risen in an area that stretches for around 20 miles on the northern rim of the caldera.
Yellowstone National Park is often celebrated as a sanctuary of untouched wilderness, a triumph of conservation. Yet, beneath this ideal lies a far more complicated and unsettling story. For decades, humans engineered the park's ecosystem, systematically removing predators and reshaping the landscape in ways that scientists are only beginning to fully understand. When wolves were finally reintroduced in the 1990s, it wasn't just an ecological experiment. It was a challenge to decades of human control, a confrontation between politics, law, and nature itself. The question remains, did we restore Yellowstone or merely rewrite its chaos? The architectures of systematic eradication. The founding of Yellowstone National Park in 1872 is often celebrated as the birth of modern conservation, a pristine sanctuary carved out of the American West. But this origin story hides a much darker reality. In its infancy, the world's first national park was never intended to be a balanced ecosystem. Instead, it was managed as a curated game farm, a manufactured landscape designed to protect the animals tourists wanted to see: elk, deer, and bighorn sheep, while systematically destroying the animals that actually kept the land healthy. This was not a wilderness in the way we understand it today. It was a high-stakes experiment in ecological engineering. The institutional hostility toward the gray wolf began with a clinical, state-sponsored efficiency. By 1884, the state of Montana had instituted a wolf bounty, offering a single dollar for every wolf killed. To a modern ear, a dollar seems trivial. But in the late 19th century, it was a clear signal that the government viewed the wolf as a biological debt that needed to be settled. This regional hatred soon found federal muscle. When the U.S. Army took over park administration in 1886, they brought a military precision to the task of predator control. Alongside the U.S. Biological Survey, created in 1885, the Army functioned as the enforcement arm of a policy that labeled wolves, cougars, and bears as injurious to both the burgeoning livestock industry and the park's recreational mission. As the 20th century dawned, the campaign of eradication shifted from a defensive measure to an outright hit job funded by taxpayers. In 1914, the U.S. Congress reached into the public purse to appropriate specific funds for the destruction of wolves and any other animal deemed harmful to agriculture. This was a monumental moment in bureaucratic history. A legislative body was effectively signing a death warrant for a species under the guise of progress. The language used by officials at the time was devoid of any ecological nuance. The superintendent's annual report of 1915 described wolves as a decided menace to the herds of elk and deer. The message was clear. The wolf was a thief, stealing the game that belonged to the American public and the cattle that belonged to the ranchers. When the National Park Service was formed in 1916, it didn't bring a new philosophy of protection. It inherited a mandate for extermination. Between 1914 and 1926, the very agency we now associate with the protection of wildlife oversaw the systematic slaughter of at least 136 wolves within the park boundaries. There was no room for mercy in this institutional architecture. Trappers and rangers didn't just target adult wolves, they sought out dens to ensure the next generation never had a chance to breathe. In 1923, the last known wolf den in Yellowstone was found and destroyed. The climax of this century-long war occurred in 1926 near Soda Butte Creek. The final official act of eradication wasn't a grand battle against a massive alpha, but the quiet killing of 2 pups. With those 2 shots, the gray wolf was effectively erased from the Yellowstone landscape. The violence of the U.S. Biological Survey's mission had achieved its goal, leaving behind a haunting silence that would last for 70 years. The ghost of the missing keystone. When the last wolf pups were killed in 1926, the architects of Yellowstone believed they had finally secured the park's future as a peaceful sanctuary for grazers. Instead, they had inadvertently triggered a 70-year biological collapse. Without the top-down pressure of a primary predator, the northern Yellowstone elk herd underwent a demographic explosion that the landscape was never designed to handle. By the 1980s and early 1990s, the population had ballooned to a staggering 16,000 individuals. This wasn't just a matter of more animals on the hillside, it was a fundamental shift in how those animals interacted with the earth. The Lamar Valley, once a vibrant tapestry of life, began to look like a hollowed-out wasteland. In a functioning ecosystem, elk are constantly on the move, wary of the shadows where a predator might be lurking. But in the absence of wolves, the elk became sedentary. They lingered in the river valleys, essentially setting up permanent residence in the most sensitive riparian zones. They didn't just graze the grass. They systematically consumed every young willow, aspen, and cottonwood sprout before the trees could even reach maturity. This prevented the next generation of forest from ever taking root. It was a slow-motion erasure of the park's vertical structure. The warning signs were there almost immediately, though they were treated as ignored prophecies. As early as 1929 and 1933, scientific teams visiting the park reported that the range was in deplorable condition. They documented massive soil erosion and the dying off of woody species due to sustained overconsumption. These researchers saw a landscape that was literally being eaten alive. Yet the management at the time remained committed to the idea that the park could thrive without its apex predator. This degradation triggered a catastrophic chain reaction that reached far beyond the elk. The loss of willow stands meant the end of the line for the park's beavers. Beavers are ecosystem engineers, but they require willow for both their winter food caches and the construction of their dams. As the willow vanished, so did the beavers. Their disappearance led to a collapse of the park's natural plumbing. Without beaver dams to slow the flow of water, streams began to cut deeply into the earth, a process known as incision. This dropped the water table, effectively draining the surrounding land and causing the loss of wetlands essential for amphibians, songbirds, and hundreds of other species. The very lifeblood of the valley was being channeled away, leaving behind a dry, scarred trench where a lush marsh should have been. During this era, the predator hierarchy was also thrown into a strange, unbalanced state. The coyote, a versatile mesopredator, stepped into the void left by the wolf and became the park's de facto apex hunter. While the coyote is a formidable animal, it lacks the size and pack structure to regulate the massive elk herds. Instead, the coyote population surged and focused its energy on smaller prey. This resulted in the oversuppression of pronghorn fawns and small rodents, which in turn limited the success of red foxes and various birds of prey that relied on those same food sources. The ecosystem wasn't just missing one animal, it was being distorted from the top down. In the 1960s, the National Park Service doubled down on a policy known as natural regulation. The assumption was that nature would eventually find its own balance and that elk numbers would be limited naturally by food availability rather than predation. This proved to be a hubristic failure of management. Instead of stabilizing, the elk population continued its boom and bust cycles, leading to massive starvation events that horrified the public and further decimated the range. By the late 1980s, the scientific community reached a sobering consensus: the legal and logistical restoration. Bringing the wolf back to Yellowstone was not just a biological mission, it was a decades-long legal and political heist. After the systematic eradication of the early 20th century, the first real crack in the wall appeared with the passage of the 1973 Endangered Species Act. By 1974, the gray wolf was officially listed as endangered, providing the federal mandate required to even begin discussing a return. But the path from a piece of paper in Washington, D.C., to a howling pack in the Lamar Valley required over 20 years of high-stakes negotiation against a backdrop of intense regional hostility. The true scale of this conflict was revealed during the creation of the 1994 Environmental Impact Statement. This document became the center of a massive public battle, drawing over 160,000 formal comments. At the time, it was the largest public engagement in the history of any federal proposal, reflecting a nation deeply divided between those who saw the wolf as a symbol of wilderness and those who saw it as a threat to their way of life. To move forward, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had to engineer a political ceasefire. They did this through a specific legal loophole known as the Section 10J designation. By labeling the reintroduced wolves as a non-essential experimental population, the government created a critical compromise. Inside the park, the wolves would be fully protected federal assets. However, if they crossed the invisible boundary onto private ranch land and preyed on livestock, they could be lethally removed. This designation was the only reason the project survived the political pressure of the mid-90s. It turned a rigid biological protection into a flexible management tool that gave local communities a sense of control over a predator they hadn't seen in generations. With the legal framework in place, the operation shifted to a massive logistical undertaking. Between 1995 and 1997, 41 wolves were captured in Alberta and British Columbia, Canada, and transported across the border. This wasn't as simple as releasing them into the woods and hoping they stayed. Biologists faced a significant problem: the wolf's internal homing compass. If simply dropped into the park, these animals would likely have immediately started a northward trek back to their original territories hundreds of miles away. The climax of this years-long effort arrived on January 12, 1995. The first shipment of wolves traveled toward the park's iconic Roosevelt Arch, but the drama wasn't over. In a final attempt to stop the clock, the Wyoming Farms Bureau filed a lawsuit and secured a temporary injunction. For a few tense hours, the wolves sat in their transport crates just outside the park gates while lawyers argued in a federal courtroom. When the injunction was finally lifted, the crates passed under the arch, signaling the end of the eradication era. It wasn't until March 1995 that the acclimation pens were finally opened. The first paw prints in the Lamar Valley marked the end of a 70-year absence and the beginning of the most significant experiment in modern conservation. The return of the wolf was a triumph of legal maneuvering and biological planning, but it was also a reminder of how much effort is required to undo a single decade of institutionalized destruction. The heist was successful, and the ghost of the missing keystone had finally been replaced by a living, breathing predator. The crucible of scientific methodology. For nearly 30 years, the world has been told a beautiful, almost miraculous story about the wolves of Yellowstone. It is a narrative of a perfect healing, a top-down restoration where a single predator's return triggered a domino effect known as a trophic cascade, fixing everything from the height of the trees to the shape of the rivers. It was a story of hope and the power of nature to self-correct. But as we move through 2025 and 2026, a scientific civil war has broken out, suggesting that the math behind this miracle might be fundamentally flawed. The fairy tale is meeting the crucible of rigorous methodology, and the results are far more complicated than a viral video would lead you to believe. The opening shots of this intellectual conflict were fired in early 2025 by a study led by researcher William Ripple. This study argued for a strong cascade hypothesis, claiming that the return of wolves had triggered a staggering 1,500% increase in willow crown volume between 2001 and 2020. This 16-fold explosion in growth was attributed to a concept called the ecology of fear. The theory suggests that elk don't even need to be killed by wolves to change the landscape. They simply need to be afraid. By avoiding risky areas like deep river gorges where they might be trapped by a pack, the elk allowed the vegetation in those zones to recover. In this version of the story, the wolf is a godlike architect, reshaping the park through the mere shadow of its presence. However, by late 2025 and early 2026, a vigorous rebuttal emerged in the journal Global Ecology and Conservation, led by Daniel McNulty and David Cooper. Their argument was blunt. The math simply didn't add up. They accused the strong cascade proponents of using a tautological model, a circular logic where the conclusion is baked into the starting formula. Essentially, the researchers used the height of the plants to calculate their total volume, and then used that volume to prove that the plants were getting taller. It was a mathematical guarantee of success that didn't necessarily reflect the biological reality on the ground. When you use a variable to define itself, you aren't discovering a miracle, you are just looking in a mirror. The critique went even deeper into the geometry of the park. The 2025 study had applied idealized half-ellipsoid geometric models to estimate the size of the willows. But willows in northern Yellowstone aren't perfect, symmetrical shapes. They are heavily browsed, distorted, and asymmetrical bushes struggling to survive in a harsh environment. Applying a clean mathematical shape to a messy biological reality created an illusion of recovery that far outpaced what was actually happening in the dirt. This wasn't just a disagreement over numbers, it was a challenge to the entire wolves fixed everything paradigm. This debate forced a shift toward a more nuanced, context-dependent model of ecology. Instead of a simple linear chain from wolf to elk to willow, researchers like McNulty argue that Yellowstone is a non-equilibrium system. This means the park hasn't just snapped back to the way it was in 1920. Too many other factors have changed. The water tables are still low from the decades-long absence of beavers. The climate is shifting, and a new player has entered the field: the bison. Unlike elk, bison are largely invulnerable to wolf predation and have become the dominant massive herbivores of the northern range. They continue to browse heavily on the same riparian plants the wolves were supposed to protect. The central question of 2026 is whether the wolf is a majestic restorer or just another gear in a broken, complex machine. The recovery of the landscape is constrained by abiotic factors, like hydrology and soil health, that a predator cannot fix simply by existing. The landscape of fear might exist, but it is being drowned out by the reality of a changing climate and a multi-competitor food web. We are learning that nature doesn't always return to a previous state of grace. It reorganizes into something new. The miracle of Yellowstone isn't that it was fixed, but that it is a living, breathing laboratory where our own assumptions about how the world works are constantly being dismantled by the very animals we tried to save. The paradox of riparian engineering. If you have seen the viral documentaries about Yellowstone, you know the story of the beaver. It is often presented as the ultimate proof of the wolf's success. We were told that by thinning the elk herds, wolves allowed the willow trees to return, which in turn gave the beavers the food and building materials they needed to move back into the northern range. On the surface, the data initially supported this miracle. Before the 1995 reintroduction, the northern range was a biological desert for these aquatic engineers, hosting only a single documented colony. By 2007, aerial surveys recorded a peak of 127 active colonies. It looked like a total restoration of the park's natural plumbing. But nature rarely follows a neat, linear script, and the data from the last decade has revealed a terrifying reversal. Recent surveys conducted between 2015 and 2018 have exposed what scientists are calling the beaver paradox. In some key study areas, the population didn't just level off, it crashed. Colony density plummeted from 6.1 per kilometer to a staggering 0.4. The beaver, the very animal supposed to be the beneficiary of the wolf's return, was suddenly vanishing again. To understand why, we have to look past the wolf and the elk and acknowledge a new shadow looming over the riverbanks. The bison. As the elk population declined under the pressure of wolf predation, a different herbivore stepped into the vacuum. The bison population in Yellowstone has surged, and these animals bring a completely different set of rules to the ecosystem. Unlike the elk, which are vulnerable to wolf packs and can be pushed into a state of flight or fear, an adult bison is an invulnerable antagonist. They are too large, too powerful, and too aggressive for most wolf packs to effectively regulate. While the wolves were busy managing the elk, the bison were quietly taking over the riparian zones. This has created a new, multi-competitor struggle for survival that looks less like a balanced circle of life and more like a high-stakes game of territorial dominance. Bison are heavy-set herbivores that require massive amounts of forage, and they have begun to devastate the very same willow stands that the beavers need to survive. Because the wolves cannot easily stop the bison, the riparian vegetation is once again being suppressed, but this time by an animal that doesn't care about the landscape of fear. The beavers, caught in the middle, are losing their food source and their building supplies to a competitor they cannot outmaneuver. This shift has forced ecologists to rewrite the beaver-willow-wolf triad into a far more complex equation involving climate-driven hydrology and non-equilibrium dynamics. The park's recovery is being throttled by a lack of water. Even if the willow tries to grow, the stream incision caused by those 70 wolf-free years has dropped the water table so low that the soil is often too dry to support a massive forest. The beavers need the willow to build the dams that raise the water table, but they need the water table to be high enough for the willow to grow in the first place. It is a biological catch-22, the violent restructuring of power. When the gray wolf returned to Yellowstone in 1995, it didn't just re-enter the food chain. It initiated a hostile takeover of an empire that had been left unguarded for 70 years. During the wolves' long absence, the coyote had ascended to the role of the park's apex predator. In a vacuum, the coyote was king, expanding its numbers and influence across the northern range. But this was a sovereignty built on ecological technicality. The moment the first collars were released, the coyote was reminded of what a true apex predator looks like. This wasn't a transition toward peaceful coexistence. It was a violent, systematic purging of a pretender to the throne. The impact was immediate and devastating. This phenomenon, known as intra-guild competition, is a polite scientific term for one predator species hunting and killing another to eliminate a competitor. Within just 2 years of the wolves' release, coyote abundance in wolf-occupied territories plummeted by a staggering 90%. This wasn't just about wolves outcompeting coyotes for food, it was about direct predation. Wolves began clearing the field, actively seeking out and killing coyotes to reclaim their historical dominance over the landscape. For the coyote, the Lamar Valley transformed from a land of plenty into a theater of war. The coyotes that survived were forced into a desperate exile. They had to adapt or die, often retreating to steeper, more mountainous terrain. Their smaller size, once a disadvantage in a direct confrontation, became their only saving grace on these vertical hillsides. By moving into territory that was too rugged for the heavier, more powerful wolf packs to navigate effectively, the remnants of the coyote population found a fragile safety. This spatial exclusion effectively right-sized the predator guild, pushing the coyote back into the subordinate role it was always meant to occupy. The raven's terrifying cognitive map. For decades, the relationship between wolves and scavengers was viewed as a simple matter of opportunism. Wolves are notoriously messy eaters. Unlike mountain lions that hide their kills or human hunters who haul them away, a wolf pack leaves a substantial trail of carrion in its wake. This year-round meat subsidy has long been known to support a massive cast of characters, from grizzly bears emerging hungry from hibernation to bald eagles and magpies. But in March 2026, a groundbreaking study from the University of Washington and the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior shattered our understanding of the most iconic scavenger of all, the common raven. We used to think these birds were just clever tag-alongs, following the wolves like shadows to find their next meal. The reality is far more unsettling. By tracking 69 ravens and 20 wolves with GPS collars over 2.5 years, researchers discovered that the myth of the raven following the wolf is exactly that, a myth. The data revealed that ravens do not actually spend their time shadowing active packs. Instead, they are operating as sophisticated aerial cartographers. They aren't reacting to the hunt in real time. They are utilizing an intense spatial memory to build cognitive maps of what scientists call productive landscapes. These birds have memorized exactly where wolf kills have historically occurred across the vast Yellowstone wilderness, and they use that data to predict where the next one is likely to be. The most striking evidence of this intelligence is the beeline. Rather than wandering the park in search of a pack, the GPS data showed ravens flying in perfectly straight lines over distances as great as 155 kilometers to reach specific kill sites. They aren't following a scent trail or a visual cue from a moving predator. They are flying toward a memory. This cognitive adaptation allows them to profit from the seemingly unpredictable nature of wolf kills by relying on learned patterns of predator behavior. It suggests that ravens possess a level of spatial intelligence and animal communication that we are only beginning to quantify. The cost of coexistence. The return of the wolf has created a bifurcated economic landscape in the greater Yellowstone area, where one person's biological miracle is another person's financial ruin. In gateway communities like Gardner, Montana, the wolf is an absolute goldmine. The Lamar Valley, now famously dubbed America's Serengeti, has become the epicenter of a massive ecotourism engine. By 2021, wolf-centric tourism was pumping an estimated $82.7 million annually into the local economy, a staggering 236% increase from just 15 years prior. For the hotels, guide services, and restaurants of the region, the existence value of the wolf is a multi-million-dollar lifeline that has transformed the very identity of the American West. But just beyond the park's invisible borders, that same wolf is a relentless and often uncompensated nightmare for the ranching industry. The true cost of coexistence is far higher than the market value of a lost calf. For agricultural producers, the primary drain is actually invisible: predator-induced stress. When cattle sense wolves nearby, they stop grazing and spend their energy bunched in defensive formations. This behavioral shift leads to significant weight loss and reduced weaning weights. The math is crushing. A University of Arizona study found that even a minor 2% calf loss combined with a 3.5% reduction in weight can slash a ranch's net annual revenue by 28%. When you add the $79 per cow required for range riders and specialized fencing, the economic burden of the wolf becomes an existential threat to traditional livelihoods. This economic friction has ignited a legal firestorm that reached a breaking point in late 2025 and early 2026. In December 2025, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Pet and Livestock Protection Act, or H.R. 845. This legislation is a blunt instrument designed to force the delisting of the gray wolf across the lower 48 states. Crucially, the bill includes a provision that bars judicial review, a move intended to prevent environmental groups from using the court system to overturn the decision. It is an attempt to settle the wolf debate once and for all through legislative mandate rather than scientific or judicial consensus.